5 iconic archers that fantasy forgets. Fantasy archers tend to come in one of 3 flavours. The ranger, who uses their bow with dexterity, carries lightweight backup weapons, and uses their wits and agility to navigate their environment. The rogue, who uses their bow with dexterity, carries a lightweight backup, and uses their wits and agility to navigate their environment. And the battlefield mook, who come in large numbers, fall quickly to the simplest of attacks, and whose arrows do very little to actually bother the heroes. But history can sometimes be more varied than fiction. Archery has been around for tens of thousands of years and has been used in warfare for a good chunk of that time. And across that time, bows have been used with a variety of different techniques, different backup equipment, and different battlefield tactics. So game designers, writers, DMs, etc. take note, because while there's no way I could cover all of them, in this video we're going to talk about a bunch of archery archetypes that fantasy either rarely includes or straight up forgets about. But first, a word from our sponsors. Halloween is over. Winter is fast approaching, and with it comes the annual pressure to buy loads of cheap tat that simply won't last. But if you're looking for a gift that's genuinely cool and a little more enduring, check out Thorum.com. Their jewellery features a bunch of interesting materials like storied wood, fossilised dinosaur bones and meteorite, and is inspired by various characters from mythology and history, including this archery themed ring which is made from the wood of a whiskey barrel and fits very closely to my usual aesthetic. And I'm not the only one, because I didn't even get a chance to film this ad before my wife had claimed one for herself. But that's not all. With every ring purchase they also send out a silicone ring, and I have genuinely been wearing this since it arrived. It's the most comfortable silicone ring I've ever had. I don't have to take it off when I'm exercising, and it's even good for shooting arrows. Each bit of jewellery comes with a lifetime warranty, so you know you're buying something that's gonna last. So whether you want a meaningful gift for someone special, or just something cool for yourself, head to Thorum.com and use code BLUMINECK20 for 20% off. The first thing that I want to cover is Viking Archers, because although the Vikings are very frequently associated with madmen who run at you with an axe, they also fielded archers in many of their battles. Although Norse and Danish warriors of the Viking period did occasionally engage in open warfare, a lot of their combat was more about skirmishing. They'd run in, hit hard, and run back out. And the axe was great for that. But so was the bow. And while a lot of film depictions of Viking archers have them in the background shooting in ranks, the same as many other medieval archery depictions, historical artwork that shows Viking archers frequently shows them running, and there are even depictions of archers from the time period using different techniques and quivers alongside each other to achieve different types of mobile shot. There are even archaeological finds of specially made widened arrow nocks that would have made it easier to get the arrow onto the string quickly, and sources often show them shooting from a low position on the body that would have been conducive to keeping your eyes open and your wits about you as you run about. So they were fast, and they were agile, and they were skirmishers. The biggest difference between these Viking Age warriors and the fantasy archetype was their choice of backup. Because while many of them would have carried a knife or a Landsknechte as backup, they also had a bunch of different options to their disposal, including, in the earlier periods, bladed or pointed bows that could be used to stab the enemy when they got up close, and of course, the standard fallback of the time being an axe or a decently hefty sword, if they could afford one, that they could use to plough through their enemies once they ran out of arrows or they got into close range. In general, the idea of an archer going into battle or warfare with nothing as backup except for a small knife, or maybe 2 of them, is a little bit silly. In real life, it's easy enough to carry multiple melee weapons on your person and still be able to run around and do some agile shooting, while leaving yourself with the option to switch through a range of different backups as the occasion called for it. And while the particular backup weapon chosen could vary a lot, from sword and shield through a 2-handed sword to a katana and a tanto, or even a 2-handed maul hammer, the fact remains that the fantasy archetype of only carrying lightweight backup weapons doesn't apply to real-world historical battlefield archery. And with that in mind, let's have a look at our next historical archer, the English longbowman. This is perhaps the most archetypal medieval European archer in existence, and it is the basis of a lot of the depictions of the kind of mook archers that come in vast numbers and plough barrages of arrows into their enemies. But there are a few ways that this particular historical build of archer varied from the fantasy archetype, and the biggest one is strength. The standard fantasy bow is a dexterity or agility based weapon that is used with speed and coordination to launch arrows at your enemy. But that's not strictly true in history.
Many historical bows, in fact the majority of historical bows used in war, require a reasonably significant amount of strength to draw back. This particular bow is on the lighter end of European war bows at about 87 pounds or approximately 40 kilos at full draw, which means that every single arrow shot is the equivalent of that amount of weight, and you can see how quickly that has an effect on the target. But it also has an impact on the archer. Drawing that amount of weight back repeatedly over a prolonged period of time requires a decent amount of strength. And as armour of the time improved, the weight of the bows that was needed to counter it also increased, meaning that the kind of archers that were drawing longbows in the late medieval period could be pulling up to 2.5 times this draw weight. These were not weedy stick figures using dexterity as their primary stat. These were strong and powerful warriors, and as a result their choice of backup often utilised that. One of the standard backup weapons of choice for a medieval archer would be a sword and shield, especially a small shield like a buckler, because I could shoot relatively comfortably with this bow, drawing more arrows from my hip or from the ground without it impacting on this. But if I can see somebody coming in close and I would like to deal with them, then I can very quickly have a full melee setup, something that I can use for defense and something that I can use for attack. This particular sword is a falchion, a cutting sword from the 1400s, which would allow an archer to use the strength in their arms and their shoulders to inflict blows that were equivalent in power and force to those of an axe. But it can also be used relatively quickly if it needs to, and has a wicked clip point which allows for a very powerful thrust. It certainly isn't the most finessed melee weapon, but for an archer something like this was an excellent backup that allowed them to put a lot of power in without having to spend loads of time training their sword. But the mighty strength of someone pulling a 180 or 200 pound bow on a regular basis meant that sometimes a sword like this could feel a little bit weedy. And there are reported occasions when the archers in the back lines would pick up the mauls and the hammers that were used for ramming stakes into the ground against cavalry and bring them to bear against their opponents, smashing through armour and whacking away at their opponents just through sheer brute force. But it didn't just stop at improvised weapons either. Over time, the English archers became renowned for their skill and their power and started to be recruited into other armies, in particular the armies of Burgundy and the Landsknechts under Emperor Maximilian. And these were people who did not shirk at the idea of a large backup weapon. And in fact, there are reports of battles where the Burgundian archers, having been closed down in melee and unable to use their bows properly, cast them aside and drew from their belts two-handed swords, which they brought to bear on their opponents with frightening efficiency and made short work of them. And while they were probably not quite as large as these swords, it's worth remembering that the Landsknechte, who did wield swords like this, also recruited English longbowmen and homegrown archers and used the heaviest possible bows and the largest arrows they could find. There are reports of men going into battle dressed like that, wielding arrows 39 inches in length and carrying two-handed swords, striking fear into their enemies in battle. So when it comes to English longbowmen and the various armies they were recruited into, archers were as much a strength build as any kind of dexterity, and they acted like it, both at range and in melee. But archers with Zweihanders were still relatively uncommon, and there's another archer archetype which is still relatively rare in fantasy that accounts for some of the most successful armies ever to field archers in battle: the horseback archer. Because while fantasy and video game combat very rarely features mounted archery to any reasonable extent, at least outside of tactical sims, in history, mounted archers could be found from Lower and Eastern Europe all the way out to the steppes of Mongolia and across into Northern America. The majority of cultures that used archers in warfare to a significant extent did so from horseback, and there are even examples in Western Europe of archers adapting to be able to shoot from horseback occasionally, just because of the advantages that it deals you. Because the primary problem that anyone wielding a bow against their enemies faces is that while you're busy shooting arrows into your enemies and plinking away, they can be charging towards you, and once they get in close, your bow becomes useless and you're left a little bit more vulnerable than if you'd been carrying a big weapon or a shield or something like that from the start. You either have to take time to switch, which means time that you could have spent shooting arrows, Or you'd compromise because you weren't able to wear armor that was as chunky and as movement restrictive as somebody that maybe was wielding a polearm or a spear. But shooting arrows from horseback solves a lot of those problems. You can, of course, be still vulnerable if you're caught up close, but if you're on a lightly armoured horse and you're good at riding it, you can move as fast as anyone on a horse with a melee weapon, meaning that you're only really vulnerable to changes in terrain or other horseback archers. And the armies of China, Japan, Assyria, Turkey, Mongolia, Hungary, and many others use this to devastating effect, charging their horses in close, loosing a volley of arrows, and charging back out of reach again, only staying within range for the minimum possible amount of time and spending all of that time shooting enough arrows to cause people to take cover. It resulted in a bunch of different archery techniques and tactics that you just don't really see with ground archery. And one of the most prominent of these is burst shooting. If you're only going to be in range of your enemies for a short amount of time, then you want to be able to shoot a couple of arrows off reasonably quickly and then ride back out of range and carry on. Burst shooting can be fascinating because it takes a vast amount of energy expenditure and coordination in a short period of time. If you're on the ground and your enemies aren't moving that fast, then it's not always that useful. But for those quick periods of rapid horse shooting with time in between to draw extra arrows, line them up correctly, get their nocks sorted, and then be ready to go the minute you come back into range with another burst of arrows, they are perfect. Now, there are a few different techniques for doing this, and a few of them work from the ground as well. My particular favourite is to hold several arrows in the hand and shoot them one after the other in relatively quick succession. And while I've by no means mastered it, there are reports of people being able to shoot several arrows per second with techniques like this. Other forms of speed shooting might involve holding your second arrow in your hand and shooting like that, or even having it facing downwards in the bow hand, flicking it into position and shooting again. And because of how widespread horseback archery was, variations of these techniques could be found used with arrows held in the bow hand, on the back in a quiver, at the side in a quiver, strapped to the horse, all sorts of different things that meant you would be able to retrieve some more arrows and make some more shots. But in all of these cases, the key difference between these styles of archery and what we tend to see for fantasy characters is the extra mobility provided by the horse. It was a way of life that required you and your horse to be perfectly in tune, you to be perfectly balanced, and for you to be able to aim and shoot rapidly on the fly consistently. And that's one of the reasons we don't see it very often in video games, because being able to develop that kind of coordination even in a game is hard. So without some kind of auto aiming, being able to apply these sort of rapid techniques with a controller is actually really hard. And the second reason, especially when it comes to tabletop fantasy or something where you don't actually require real world skill to be able to do it, the other problem is that it's wildly unbalanced. If you want to apply these mechanics to a setting where a lot of people are fighting on foot, you are simply going to be overpowered in the majority of cases by having more speed, more mobility, and still being able to hit with power. It's going to be really, really hard to combat, and that is why armies primarily composed of horseback archers were able to raid across the majority of Asia and conquer vast parts of the world. But there is a particular archetype that I want to quickly cover while we look at horseback archers, and that is of the Mamluk. Now, the Mamluks were slaves of the Ottoman Empire who were trained basically from birth to be effective horseback archers. They used some of the speed shooting techniques that I mentioned earlier, but they also developed and used some really interesting techniques for switching from melee to ranged combat, allowing them to be an effective threat as light cavalry at multiple types of distance. And one of these involved the use of a sword and a bow at the same time. Now, this particular horse bow is a Turkish style bow, but it is 85 pounds, and I cannot comfortably thumb draw this bow to full draw because I don't train thumb draw very often. And unfortunately, this technique requires it, so I'll do what I can. What they would do is they wielded a curved sword. Again, this is an English falchion, but something vaguely similar to this in shape. They would flick it back, and because it was a single-edged sword, it could rest neatly on the arm without too much bother, and the pommel of the sword could be gripped in the fingers of the hand. If you flick it correctly, it allows you to switch your hand around like this and have your thumb and forefinger free. With that, you can grab an arrow from a sheath on your leg, move the arrow onto the bow, check down the length of the arrow to make sure there is no damage to it, place it onto the string, cup your thumb around the bowstring, draw and shoot while still holding the sword. And this can be done relatively quickly without too much bother. You can get ready to shoot, draw, bam, shot made. And then, as you make those shots into your enemy as you ride towards them, or at the enemy that you're riding away from, when you come back towards them, you can just flick the sword into your hand, make some slashes up close, flick it back into your shooting position, and then shoot as you ride away. Tactics like this allow the archers to deal with different kinds of threats in different ways. For lighter infantry, they could charge in with their sword and hack away at them. If the infantry were armed with spears that could be a problem for the horses, they could stay at range and shoot back. And if they got closed in by other cavalry, then the ability to switch ranges and use weapons differently would allow them to find an edge in a lot of scenarios. But there is another culture that used both horseback and ground archery and produced some of the most iconic warrior archers in history. Except that a lot of fantasy forgets that that's what they were. The samurai. Famous for their use of the katana or samurai sword, their iconic and distinctive armor, their codes of honor, and weirdly enough, not for the fact that for the majority of their history they were primarily archers. In fact, so much so that the way of the samurai was often called the way of the horse and the bow, rather than the way of the sword or something like that. Like most Japanese archers, samurai tended to wield the iconic Yumi bow, which, unlike this one, which is mostly symmetrical from a point around here, was completely asymmetric. It had a shorter limb at the lower part and a massive long limb at the top, allowing them to be used from horseback without a long lower limb that would get in the way, while giving them the power and the draw length to pull back an arrow to somewhere around here and launch it with incredible force towards their enemies. They used a balance of speed and power in their archery, with bows ranked by how many men it took to strung them. This, at around 80 pounds, was probably getting into the realms of a 2-man bow, but they would go up to a 5-man bow, sitting at somewhere around 200 pounds in extreme and unique cases. But aside from the shape of their bows, there were a few other distinctive features to samurai archery that is not seen as much in other cultures. The level of craftsmanship that went into producing arrows was often far and away above what was used for warfare arrows in other cultures. Arrows are expensive to produce, and if you're shooting a lot of them in a barrage, you haven't got time to make sure they're fancy. European longbow arrows actually probably got less fancy over time as they needed to just produce more and more of them. But for a samurai archer, the type of arrow that you shot could convey your status to the person that you were shooting, and the delicacy and intricacy of the design would have taken a lot of time and money to produce. As with many of the other cultures mentioned before, it is worth noting that these bows that they used were powerful and required heavy draw weights. And in fact, using heavy bows was considered a subject of honor and status, to the extent that there are reports of a general risking his life to retrieve a fallen bow, not because of the importance or significance of that particular bow as a cultural weapon to him, but because he did not want his enemies to find out that he was using a mere 2-man bow when he could have been using a 4- or 5-man bow as a distinctive general. But because of the strength required to pull back the bow, that also translated into other forms of combat, and the time that the samurai dedicated to the art of warfare, then their backup weapons were the same as any other samurai weapon that you might expect to see, often going into battle with a katana and another sword and a bow, and sometimes, in some cases, because these bows were so stout and so tough, they could stick a blade on the end of that and wield it as a spear in the midst of combat, and also still be able to switch to their backup weapons. These, as with the others, were not your dainty rogue or ranger that relies on dexterity. They were powerfully built, strong warriors. But it's also worth noting that the combat that they used with bows is very different from modern Japanese kyudo archery. In much the same way that modern Olympic target archery has been designed to be slow and accurate and has lost some of the power and speed that were important factors of historical archery, so too has kyudo developed a sort of spiritual aspect that has been enhanced and pushed as it became more of a sport and a discipline rather than a style of warfare. The historical samurai were noted for being able to shoot arrows quickly, as it were many other cultures, while kyudo is at its heart a discipline of form and focus that eschews speed in favor of perfection. But when we're looking at historical warfare and the historical use of bows in samurai combat, you have to remember that what they were doing was faster and probably less precise than the modern sport of Kyudo. Another notable feature of Japanese archery was their equipment and tactics. In static combat engagements, Japanese archers would use large shields and shoot around them, returning back to knock their second arrow from cover and then shooting again. And there are even reconstructions of Japanese archery that involve shooting from a kneeling position, dropping down prone to draw the second arrow, and then rising up to shoot again, allowing you to take cover from enemy archers before making your shot. How effective this would be has been disputed. If the rate of shooting is relatively fast, then there isn't time to come down and up, and you're reducing your effectiveness by doing it. But if you're looking to conserve your arrows, or there are ground features that you can use to your advantage, then it might just have the potential to save your life. And while some of these tactics are more associated with the lower status ashigaru than the samurai themselves, there are some cases of people rising through the ranks to become samurai, and it's reasonably likely that they were translated from one to the other. But as a result, they were some of the most versatile archers in history, with a combination of highly skilled and trained melee combat, fantastic horseback archery, powerful and fast shooting, and good skill at ground-based archery and melee combat as well. And then there's the last one. I've spoken about ground archery on foot, and I've spoken about archery on horseback, but what I've not spoken about is pirate archery. If I were to tell you to picture a pirate right now, then a bow would probably not figure into it anywhere. They would be wielding a cutlass, most likely, probably some pistols. They might have a beard or a mustache. They'd probably have a hat, maybe with a feather in it, and a long coat. But piracy is older than most of those technologies, and the vast majority of piracy has existed in times pre-gunpowder, or at least pre its regular use. And so, bows have played an important part in naval warfare for a very, very long time. And even after the invention of gunpowder, for a very long time, the bow remained faster, more consistent, and more accurate than the majority of guns. They carried on being used alongside each other because it took a lot more time and skill to train someone to use a bow than it did to train them to use a gun. So guns were for easy and quick use, albeit expensive, and bows were for the skilled masters that still had the technique and ability to use them. And even after the use of longbows in Europe had started to fade from ground archery, they were still being used on ships because of those qualities. As the English and the French, or the English and the Spanish, or the English and basically anybody else that we decided to pick a fight with on the water, approached each other in their ships, it was all very well waiting until you got into melee range, or shooting off a single shot from your gun and then spending a minute to reload it. But if you had some people with longbows standing on your ship, shooting arrows at your opposing enemy's deck, then you were at an advantage. Specific arrows with curved heads that were originally designed for hunting birds were great at tearing through rigging. And there are even reports of heavy longbows using powerful piercing arrows being able to punch a hole in the hull of a ship. In fact, even England's most celebrated privateer, Sir Francis Drake, had archers among his crew who, on at least one occasion, were able to target the captain of the enemy vessel and force a surrender. And while the reality of piracy in the 1500s was not exactly the swashbuckling adventures we see in films, neither was the reality of piracy in any other century. So we may as well at least have some form of swashbuckling archers in our fantasy. So there we have it. In addition to our stealthy rogue and our skirmishing ranger, we could also maybe start including an honourable samurai warrior, axe-wielding, speed-shooting Vikings, rapid-shooting horseback archers with swords, Landsknechte archers who stand proud with their fancy clothes, enormous heavy arrows, and of course, massive two-handed swords. And finally, pirate archers, sailing with Sir Francis Drake and shooting arrows for treasure and glory. Every one of them able to wield bows and melee weapons with strength and finesse, and embodying some fantasy archetypes that really don't see enough archers. If you like this video and you'd like to see more of them and maybe help motivate me to keep making them as we head into the cold winter months, then please check out my Patreon. You'll find all kinds of art references and video tutorials and more over there, as well as some of the pole dancing stuff, which you don't see as often on my channel. If you want to also help me out, you can go check out my sponsors, Thorum, and check out their range of jewelry, because anyone that buys something from that link makes me look good. So please do that. Otherwise, and as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.